Hello. When the mayor of Istanbul was dragged from his home in handcuffs this past March, millions of Turks witnessed something more than the arrest of a political rival. They saw the law itself being transformed from what was once their shield into a weapon. This is policymaker. Political intimidation is not merely about politicians fighting politicians. It represents the systematic hollowing out of civic life itself. When leaders begin bending institutions to pursue their adversaries, they plant seeds of fear that reach far beyond the halls of power, undermining the foundational values that make democratic societies like ours possible. For sake of example, we can see how this process operates across three distinct democracies: Hungary, Turkey, and the United States. But its consequences matter deeply for ordinary citizens everywhere. To understand political intimidation in the modern era, one has to first recognize that today's aspiring authoritarians have learned from history. The crude tactics of the past, mass arrests, obvious censorship, violent coups, can invite international condemnation and swift domestic resistance. Instead, contemporary power consolidation operates through what legal scholar Ozan Varol terms stealth authoritarianism, the use of ostensibly legitimate legal mechanisms for fundamentally anti-democratic ends. This creates a sort of chilling effect, a phenomenon that extends far beyond its legal origins. Citizens will begin to self-censor, not because they've been directly threatened, but because they observe what happens to those who speak out. They avoid association with certain people or organizations. They may even disengage from civic life entirely. The intimidation ultimately becomes self-perpetuating, requiring fewer and fewer direct interventions to maintain control. The genius of this approach lies in its deniability. When questioned, leaders can point to due process, the rule of law, to the independence of institutions. The persecution looks procedural, even bureaucratic. Yet the cumulative effect transforms the civic landscape, making citizens increasingly reluctant to participate in the very democratic processes that might check such abuses. Hungary offers perhaps the most systematic case study in how democratic institutions can be captured from within. When Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party returned to power in 2010, they possessed something previous Hungarian governments lacked: a constitutional supermajority and a clear understanding of how to use it. The media transformation began almost immediately. Rather than simply shuttering critical outlets, an approach that would invite obvious condemnation, Orbán's government employed economic pressure. State advertising, which represents the largest source of revenue for many Hungarian media outlets, was systematically redirected to pro-government publications. Independent media found themselves starved of resources, making them vulnerable to acquisition by businessmen with ties to the ruling party. By 2018, this process culminated in the creation of the Central European Press and Media Foundation, a private entity that now controls over 470 media outlets. Orbán declared this consolidation a matter of, quote, national strategic importance, allowing the government to bypass the rules of competition entirely. The result is that approximately 80% of Hungary's media market resources now operate under government influence. For ordinary Hungarians, this transformation has had profound daily consequences. Opposition politicians receive precisely 5 minutes of airtime on public television every 4 years, the legal minimum required before elections. Independent journalists have reported that their sources increasingly refuse to speak with them, fearing retaliation. In turn, citizens describe feeling isolated from accurate information about their own government's activities. The psychological impact, however, extends beyond media consumption. Hungarian journalists interviewed by Human Rights Watch describe a pervasive atmosphere of self-censorship. As one reporter noted, quote, "I can't do my job as a journalist anymore." The fear isn't just about losing employment, it's about the broader social consequences of being associated with dissent. Turkey's trajectory under Recep Tayyip Erdogan demonstrates how political intimidation can accelerate during moments of crisis. Attacks on press freedom and judicial independence have ultimately evolved into a comprehensive assault on political opposition. The arrest of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu in March represents more than the detention of a political rival. İmamoğlu had defeated Erdogan's candidate twice, first in 2019 and again in a repeat election that Erdogan's party forced after disputing the initial results. His popularity made him the most credible challenger to Erdogan's continued rule. The charges against İmamoğlu, corruption, criminal organization membership, terrorism, follow a pattern that has become grimly familiar in Turkey. Since March, the authorities have detained over 500 individuals connected to opposition parties. The investigation has expanded from the capital, Istanbul, to encompass opposition-controlled cities across the country, suggesting a coordinated effort to decapitate Turkey's secular democratic opposition. For Turkish citizens, the message is unmistakable. Engaging in political opposition will cost you. When İmamoğlu supporters took to the streets in protest, over 1,100 people were arrested in a single week. The government detained journalists who covered the protests. Even lawyers representing opposition figures have found themselves imprisoned by Erdogan's increasingly centralized system. This creates what may be parallel to a classic intimidation spiral. Citizens witness the consequences of dissent and adjust their behavior accordingly. They stop attending protests, they avoid political discussions, and disengage from civic organizations. The opposition's ability to mobilize is therefore systematically degraded, not through open repression, but through the calculated application of legal pressure. The American experience of political intimidation presents unique complexities, in part because it occurs within a system with stronger institutional checks, and partly because different political factions accuse each other of the same tactics. The Trump administration's return to power in 2025 has been marked by what both supporters and critics acknowledge as an unprecedented use of federal law enforcement against political opponents. The Justice Department's Weaponization Working Group, created by Attorney General Pam Bondi, explicitly targets former Special Counsel Jack Smith, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, and New York Attorney General Letitia James, all prosecutors who happen to have pursued cases against Trump. The targeting extends beyond individual prosecutors, though. There has been mass firings of career Justice Department attorneys, the dismissal of ongoing prosecutions, and threats against universities, NGOs, and media organizations, all of which creating what Professor Stephen Levitsky describes as a transition to competitive authoritarianism, a system where opposition remains legal but faces systematic disadvantages. The American case illustrates a crucial dynamic. Political intimidation often emerges in response to previous uses of legal authority that one side considers illegitimate. Trump and his supporters argue they are correcting previous weaponization by the Biden administration. Critics respond that this represents retaliation against legitimate law enforcement. This cycle of accusation and counter-accusation normalized the use of government power against political opponents. For American citizens, the consequences are increasingly visible. Legal professionals are reporting reluctance to take cases that might draw government attention. Civil society organizations describe donors becoming wary of supporting advocacy work. Even the usually powerful corporate leaders privately express concerns about public criticism of government policies. What makes political intimidation particularly insidious is how it transforms the relationship between citizens and their own government. In a healthier democracy, the law serves as a neutral arbiter, protecting the rights of all while constraining the power of officials. Political intimidation inverts this relationship, making the law itself a purposed source of uncertainty and fear. Research from countries as diverse as Uganda, Zimbabwe, the United Kingdom, and the United States demonstrates remarkably consistent effects. Citizens subjected to surveillance and intimidation report the following three primary responses: self-censorship, social withdrawal, and institutional distrust. They start to avoid expressing opinions that might draw attention. They take burdensome precautions, distancing themselves from individuals and organizations that might be considered suspicious. They can lose faith in the fairness of institutions meant to protect them. These effects snowball. You see where this is going. As civic participation declines, democratic institutions become less representative and less responsive. Opposition voices grow weaker, making it easier for those in power to push boundaries further. What began as the targeted intimidation of political elites eventually creates a broader atmosphere of withdrawal from civic life. The research is clear about who suffers the most: those already marginalized by society, immigrants, minorities, young people, and those with fewer resources have less protection against retaliation and are more likely to retreat from civic engagement entirely. This creates what can be called differential chilling, the systematic exclusion of certain voices from democratic participation. The cases of Hungary, Turkey, and the United States reveal common patterns, but they also demonstrate the contextual nature of political intimidation. In Hungary, the process has been gradual and systematic, taking place within ostensibly legal frameworks. In Turkey, crisis moments have accelerated the pace of institutional capture. In the United States, the cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation threatens to normalize what were once considered extraordinary use of government power. What unites these cases is a recognition that modern threats to democracy will rarely announce themselves through obvious violations of the law. Instead, they operate through selective application of existing legal frameworks, the economic pressure on critical institutions, and the psychological impact of watching other people face consequences for their own dissent. The history of democratic backsliding suggests that countries rarely recover from such deterioration without significant external pressure or internal crisis. Once the chilling effect takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. So I personally believe the saddest part is that citizens withdraw from civic life precisely when democratic engagement is most necessary. See, this points to a troubling paradox. The very people who might resist authoritarian drift are the ones most likely to be intimidated into silence. Meanwhile, those who support or benefit from the new arrangements have incentives to remain engaged, creating an increasingly skewed political landscape. Political intimidation succeeds not because it silences everyone, but because it silences enough people to alter the democratic balance. When citizens begin to calculate the personal costs of individual civic engagement, when lawyers avoid certain problematic cases, when journalists self-censor controversial matters, when civil society organizations moderate their advocacy, the entire ecosystem of democratic accountability is weakened. In other words, people become too scared, to an extent understandably, but also very regrettably, to fight for the democracy that gave them much of the opportunities they have enjoyed. The consequences extend beyond politics. Research demonstrates that societies with lower level of social trust struggle to alleviate collective challenges, from public health crises to economic inequality to environmental degradation. When people lose faith in institutions and in each other, cooperation becomes more difficult and shared problems become harder to solve. There is also an unfortunately long-term, generational impact. Young people, observing the risks associated with political engagement, may choose to invest their energies elsewhere. This creates what some researchers may consider civic succession failure, the breakdown of democratic knowledge and habits across generations. The transformation is often gradual enough that it becomes normalized. Citizens adjust their expectations. They accept that certain topics cannot be discussed openly, that certain organizations cannot be trusted, that certain forms of once civil opposition are now too dangerous to pursue. Democracy doesn't die in a single dark, dramatic moment. It fades through 1,000 small cuts or retreats from civic life. Democracy, we are so reminded, is not a stable equilibrium, but a continuous process of negotiation and renewal. It requires not only formal institutions, but the civic courage of ordinary people willing to participate despite risks. Political intimidation succeeds precisely because it makes such participation seem too costly, too dangerous, too futile. The whispers of fear that such tactics generate spread far beyond their intended targets. They reach teachers wondering whether to discuss controversial topics, citizens debating whether to attend town halls, volunteers questioning whether to support advocacy organizations. In the end, the most profound victory of political intimidation may be that it convinces us that silence is safety, and that withdrawal is wisdom. The choice ultimately remains ours, but it is a choice that becomes more difficult with each act of intimidation that goes unchallenged, perhaps more necessary with each retreat from the civic obligations that democracy demands. This is Policymaker. Thank you.